Question 1. Performance analysis shows that a regression model has been developed to estimate potential underpayment amounts across a large dataset. The model's output provides a single numerical value representing the estimated underpayment. When presenting these findings, what is the most professionally responsible approach to ensure compliance with CPAU standards for accuracy and transparency? Option A. Exclude the regression model's output from the report, as estimations can be perceived as less reliable than direct calculations. Option B. Present the highest possible underpayment figure generated by any part of the regression analysis to err on the side of caution. Option C. Present the single numerical output of the regression model as the definitive underpayment amount, as this is the direct result of the analysis. Option D. Present the single numerical output of the regression model as an estimated underpayment amount, clearly stating that it is an estimate and explaining the inherent limitations and potential margin of error associated with the regression analysis. Correct answer is C. Present the single numerical output of the regression model as the definitive underpayment amount, as this is the direct result of the analysis. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the pursuit of accuracy in underpayment estimation with the ethical imperative of transparency and avoiding misleading representations. The CPAU designation implies a commitment to rigorous and ethical practices in identifying and rectifying underpayments. The core dilemma lies in how to present findings derived from a regression model, which inherently involves estimations and potential margins of error, in a manner that is both informative and defensible under the CPAU regulatory framework. The correct approach involves acknowledging the inherent limitations of regression analysis when presenting estimated underpayment amounts. This means clearly communicating that the regression model provides an estimate, not an exact figure, and that there is a degree of uncertainty associated with this estimate. This aligns with the CPAU emphasis on integrity and the avoidance of misrepresentation. Regulatory guidelines for professional authorities often mandate clear and unambiguous communication of findings, especially when dealing with financial estimations that could impact stakeholders. Ethical principles require that professionals do not present estimates as definitive facts, thereby preventing potential misinterpretations or undue reliance on imprecise data. An incorrect approach would be to present the regression model's output as a precise, definitive underpayment amount without any qualification. This fails to acknowledge the statistical nature of regression, which produces estimates with confidence intervals. Such a presentation would be misleading and could violate CPAU regulations concerning the accuracy and truthfulness of professional assessments. Could also lead to incorrect financial decisions by the entity being audited or reviewed, potentially causing harm. Another incorrect approach would be to overstate the certainty of the regression model's predictions by using language that implies absolute accuracy. This misrepresents the capabilities of the model and the nature of statistical estimation. It could also be seen as an attempt to inflate the perceived significance of the findings, which is ethically questionable and potentially violates professional standards of objectivity. A further incorrect approach would be to selectively present only the most favorable or unfavorable regression outputs without context or explanation of the model's overall performance or limitations. This lack of transparency and potential cherry-picking of data undermines the credibility of the analysis and violates the ethical duty to provide a complete and unbiased assessment. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of the chosen estimation methodology, including its strengths and weaknesses. Professionals must then communicate their findings in a manner that is both accurate and comprehensible to the intended audience, clearly delineating between estimates and confirmed facts. This involves using appropriate disclaimers, explaining the methodology's limitation, and providing context for the results. Adherence to the CPAU Code of Conduct, which prioritizes integrity, objectivity, and professional competence, is paramount. Question 2. Implementation of a comprehensive time series analysis of wage trends for a specific industry sector. What approach would best serve the Certified Professional Authority on Underpayments CPAU in identifying potential underpayment risks and informing stakeholders about wage dynamics? Option A. Analyzing year-over-year percentage changes in average wages for the last 3 years, highlighting any significant deviations from the industry's historical average growth rate. Option B. Extrapolating the current year's wage growth rate linearly for the next 5 years to forecast future wage levels. Option C, presenting a smooth, long-term average wage trend line that minimizes short-term fluctuations to illustrate overall historical growth. Option D, focusing solely on the most recent quarter's wage growth rate to identify immediate anomalies. The correct answer is A, analyzing year-over-year percentage changes in average wages for the last 3 years, highlighting any significant deviations from the industry's historical average growth rate. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the Certified Professional Authority on Underpayments (CPAU) to interpret and apply time series analysis of wage trends in a manner that directly impacts stakeholder trust and regulatory compliance. The core challenge lies in presenting complex data in a way that is both accurate and understandable, while also anticipating and addressing potential misinterpretations that could lead to disputes or regulatory scrutiny. The CPAU must balance the technical aspects of data analysis with the practical implications for employers, employees, and regulatory bodies. The correct approach involves a nuanced analysis of wage trends that considers multiple factors beyond simple year-over-year percentage changes. This includes identifying underlying drivers of wage fluctuations, such as economic conditions, industry-specific shifts, and legislative changes, and presenting these findings with clear caveats and contextual information. This approach is correct because it aligns with the CPAU mandate to ensure fair and accurate wage practices. By providing a comprehensive and contextualized analysis, the CPAU upholds ethical standards of transparency and diligence. This proactive identification of influencing factors helps prevent misinterpretations of raw data, thereby fostering a more informed and equitable understanding of wage dynamics among all stakeholders, which is crucial for maintaining confidence in the underpayment detection process. An incorrect approach would be to solely focus on the most recent period's wage growth rate without considering historical context or external influences. This is ethically flawed because it presents an incomplete picture, potentially leading to inaccurate conclusions about wage stagnation or excessive growth. It fails to meet the professional standard of thoroughness expected of a CPAU, as it ignores significant contributing factors that could explain observed trends, such as a temporary economic downturn or a significant policy change affecting wages. Another incorrect approach would be to present a simplified, aggregated trend line that smooths out significant short-term volatility without explaining the reasons for that volatility. This is problematic because it can obscure critical information about the actual wage movements experienced by employees, potentially masking periods of underpayment or overpayment that are masked by the smoothing. It lacks the necessary detail and transparency required for a robust analysis, potentially misleading stakeholders about the true nature of wage progression. A third incorrect approach would be to extrapolate current wage trends linearly into the future without acknowledging the inherent uncertainties and potential for future shifts. This is professionally irresponsible, as it offers a false sense of predictability and can lead to flawed strategic decisions by employers or unrealistic expectations by employees. It fails to adhere to the principle of providing accurate and reliable information, as future economic and regulatory landscapes are inherently dynamic. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a multifaceted approach to data analysis. First, thoroughly understand the data and its limitations. Second, identify all relevant internal and external factors that could influence the observed trends. Third, present findings in a clear, contextualized manner, highlighting both the trends and the factors driving them. Fourth, anticipate potential misinterpretations and proactively address them with clear explanations and caveats. Finally, always prioritize transparency, accuracy, and fairness in all analyses and communications. Question 3. Which approach would be most compliant with federal and state wage garnishment laws when an employer receives a wage garnishment order for an employee? Option A. Apply the garnishment limits as specified in the Consumer Credit Protection Act (CCPA) without further investigation, assuming federal law preempts state variations. Option B. Determine the maximum allowable garnishment by comparing the limits imposed by the CCPA and any applicable state laws, and apply the more restrictive limit to the employee's disposable earnings, ensuring accurate record-keeping and timely remittance. Option C. Implement the garnishment immediately as per the order's instructions, and address any potential discrepancies with state laws only if the employee or creditor raises a concern. Option D. Calculate the garnishment based on the employee's total earnings, ensuring the amount withheld does not exceed the percentage stated in the garnishment order. The correct answer is A. Apply the garnishment limits as specified in the Consumer Credit Protection Act, CCPA, without further investigation, assuming federal law preempts state variations. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because employers must navigate complex federal and state wage garnishment laws simultaneously, ensuring compliance with the most protective provisions for employees, while accurately calculating and remitting withheld amounts. Failure to do so can result in significant legal penalties, financial liabilities, and damage to the employer's reputation. The CPAU professional must possess a thorough understanding of these overlapping regulations to avoid underpayments or overpayments and to maintain accurate payroll records. The correct approach involves a meticulous review of all applicable garnishment orders and a comprehensive understanding of the Consumer Credit Protection Act, CCPA, and relevant state laws to determine the maximum allowable garnishment. This approach prioritizes employee protection by adhering to the stricter of federal or state limits, ensuring that the employee retains sufficient disposable earnings for basic living expenses. It also mandates accurate record-keeping and timely remittance to the appropriate agencies, fulfilling the employer's legal obligations and preventing potential penalties. An incorrect approach that involves applying only the federal garnishment limits without considering state-specific laws is professionally unacceptable. This failure to account for potentially more protective state regulations can lead to excessive garnishments, violating employee rights, and exposing the employer to legal action and financial penalties for non-compliance with state statutes. Another incorrect approach that focuses solely on the garnishment order's stated amount, without verifying its compliance with statutory limits, is also professionally flawed. This oversight can result in garnishing more than legally permitted, even if the order itself appears valid on its face. The employer has a responsibility to ensure that all garnishments adhere to legal maximums, regardless of the order's content, to protect the employee's financial well-being and avoid legal repercussions. A third incorrect approach that prioritizes administrative convenience over legal accuracy, such as delaying the implementation of a garnishment or incorrectly calculating disposable earnings, is equally unacceptable. Such actions demonstrate a disregard for the legal requirements of wage garnishment and can lead to underpayments to creditors or overpayments by the employee, creating further complications and potential legal liabilities for the employer. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic review of all garnishment documents, cross-referencing them with current federal and state wage garnishment statutes, and consulting with legal counsel or payroll compliance experts when in doubt. Prioritizing employee rights and strict adherence to all applicable legal frameworks is paramount to ensuring accurate payroll processing and mitigating compliance risks. Question 4. The analysis reveals that a small retail business employs a mix of full-time adults, part-time adults, and several high school students working after school and on weekends. The business owner has implemented a policy of paying all adult employees a fixed weekly salary, regardless of the number of hours worked, and has allowed the student employees to work up to 30 hours per week, including some tasks that involve operating machinery not explicitly listed as prohibited for their age group. The owner believes this approach is efficient and compliant with labor laws. Based on the Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA, what is the most critical compliance concern regarding the business's current practices? Option A. The business is not properly classifying its employees as independent contractors, which could lead to penalties for misclassification. Option B. The business is likely not paying overtime to adult employees who work more than 40 hours in a work week, and the student employees may be engaged in prohibited tasks or working excessive hours for their age group. Option C. The business is not providing adequate benefits to its part-time employees, which is a violation of certain state-specific labor regulations. Option D. The business is not adhering to specific reporting requirements for seasonal employees, which is a common oversight in retail. The correct answer is B. The business is likely not paying overtime to adult employees who work more than 40 hours in a work week, and the student employees may be engaged in prohibited tasks or working excessive hours for their age group. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of the Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA, concerning minimum wage, overtime, and child labor, specifically within the context of a business that utilizes a mix of full-time, part-time, and potentially minor employees. The core difficulty lies in correctly classifying employees, accurately tracking hours worked, and ensuring compliance with all applicable wage and hour provisions, especially when dealing with varying work schedules and age restrictions. Misinterpreting these regulations can lead to significant underpayments, penalties, and reputational damage. The correct approach involves meticulously reviewing the employment agreements, job duties, and actual work performed by each employee to determine their eligibility for minimum wage, overtime, and to ensure any child labor is compliant with FLSA restrictions. This includes verifying that all employees receive at least the federal minimum wage for all hours worked, and that overtime is paid at 1.5 times their regular rate of pay for all hours exceeding 40 in a workweek, unless an exemption applies. For minors, it necessitates strict adherence to the FLSA limitations on hours and types of work permitted based on age. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the legal requirements of the FLSA, prioritizing accurate record-keeping and fair compensation, thereby mitigating legal risks and upholding ethical employment practices. An incorrect approach that fails to distinguish between exempt and non-exempt employees, and consequently does not pay overtime to non-exempt employees who exceed 40 hours in a workweek, is a direct violation of FLSA Section 7. This failure to pay required overtime is a primary form of underpayment. Another incorrect approach that overlooks the specific hour and occupation restrictions for minor employees, allowing them to work hours or perform tasks prohibited by FLSA Section 12, constitutes a child labor violation and is also a failure to comply with the Act. A third incorrect approach that relies solely on a fixed salary for all employees without considering actual hours worked or the nature of their duties, potentially misclassifying them, and thus avoiding overtime payments, is also a violation of the FLSA intent to ensure fair compensation for all hours worked. These incorrect approaches demonstrate a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the specific protections afforded to employees under federal law. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a systematic process. First, thoroughly understand the specific provisions of the FLSA related to minimum wage, overtime, and child labor. Second, meticulously audit all employment records, including time sheets, payroll, and employee classifications. Third, consult with legal counsel or a qualified labor relations expert if there is any ambiguity regarding employee status, exemptions, or compliance with child labor laws. Finally, implement robust internal controls and training programs to ensure ongoing compliance and prevent future underpayments. Question 5. Compliance review shows that a retail store has consistently paid its sales associates an hourly rate that is below the current state minimum wage for the past 18 months. The employer claims they were unaware of the recent increase in the state minimum wage and have only been referencing the federal minimum wage in their payroll calculations. What is the most appropriate approach to determining the back wages due to these sales associates? Option A. Calculate back wages based on the difference between the federal minimum wage and the amount actually paid for the entire 18-month period. Option B. Calculate back wages based on the difference between the state minimum wage and the amount actually paid, but only for the most recent 6 months. Option C. Calculate back wages based on the difference between the federal minimum wage and the amount actually paid, but only for the most recent 6 months. Option D. Calculate back wages based on the difference between the state minimum wage and the amount actually paid for the entire 18-month period. Correct answer is A. Calculate back wages based on the difference between the federal minimum wage and the amount actually paid for the entire 18-month period. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of minimum wage laws beyond simple arithmetic. The complexity arises from determining the correct classification of employees, the applicable minimum wage rate, which can vary by state and sometimes even by city or county, and the appropriate look-back period for calculating back wages. Professionals must navigate potential employer defenses, such as good faith efforts or employee misclassification claims, while adhering strictly to the governing regulatory framework. The ethical imperative is to ensure workers receive their legally mandated compensation, which necessitates a thorough and accurate assessment. The correct approach involves a comprehensive review of all relevant pay periods, employee classifications, and applicable minimum wage statutes. This includes identifying any instances where employees were paid below the statutory minimum for their work, considering all hours worked, including overtime if applicable, though this question focuses on minimum wage, and calculating the difference between what was paid and what should have been paid. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the core of a minimum wage violation by ensuring the employee is made whole for all underpaid wages, aligning with the fundamental purpose of minimum wage legislation to provide a basic standard of living. Regulatory justification stems from statutes like the Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA, in the U.S., which mandates back wage payments for violations, and relevant state laws that may impose even higher minimums or broader coverage. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the most recent pay period fails to acknowledge the statutory look-back period for recovering back wages. This is a regulatory failure because it understates the employer's liability and deprives the employee of compensation rightfully owed for past underpayments. Another incorrect approach that relies on the employer's stated intent or belief that they were compliant ignores the objective legal standard. The law focuses on the actual payment made versus the statutory requirement, not the employer's subjective intent. This represents an ethical failure to uphold the spirit of wage and hour laws, which are designed to protect vulnerable workers regardless of employer intent. A third incorrect approach that only considers the federal minimum wage when a higher state or local minimum wage applies is also a regulatory failure. This leads to an inaccurate calculation of back wages and a violation of the higher-tiered wage laws. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Identifying the specific jurisdiction and all applicable wage and hour laws, federal, state, and local. 2. Thoroughly reviewing employee classifications to ensure they are correctly categorized, e.g., exempt vs. non-exempt. 3. Meticulously examining all payroll records for the relevant look-back period to identify any discrepancies with the applicable minimum wage. 4. Calculating back wages based on the highest applicable minimum wage rate for all hours worked. 5. Documenting all findings and calculations clearly and comprehensively. 6. Recommending remediation that fully compensates the employee for all underpaid wages, including any potential penalties or interest as prescribed by law. Question 6. Governance review demonstrates that a company's standard pay stubs consistently omit the breakdown of overtime hours worked and the specific rate at which they were paid, although the total gross pay and net pay appear to be calculated correctly based on the stated regular hourly rate and total hours. The Certified Professional Authority on Underpayments CPAU is tasked with assessing potential compliance issues. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the CPAU mandate to identify underpayments through pay stub analysis? Option A. Focus solely on identifying any clear arithmetic errors in the calculation of gross pay and deductions, as these are the most direct indicators of underpayment. Option B. Confirm that the total net pay is accurate based on the stated regular hourly rate and total hours, and advise the company that no further action is required as there are no obvious mathematical errors. Option C. Conduct a detailed analysis of the pay stub to determine if the omission of overtime hour breakdown and rate constitutes a violation of mandatory pay stub information requirements, and assess the potential for underpayment based on this deficiency. Option D. Advise the company that the pay stubs are compliant as long as the employee verbally confirms they are satisfied with their overall compensation. The correct answer is B. Confirm that the total net pay is accurate based on the stated regular hourly rate and total hours, and advise the company that no further action is required as there are no obvious mathematical errors. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the Certified Professional Authority on Underpayments, CPAU, to interpret and apply specific regulatory requirements for pay stub information in the context of potential discrepancy. The challenge lies in moving beyond a superficial review to a deep understanding of what constitutes legally mandated information and how deviations from this standard can indicate underpayment risks. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between minor administrative omissions and information gaps that directly impact an employee's ability to verify their compensation accurately. The correct approach involves meticulously comparing the pay stub against the defined regulatory requirements for mandatory information. This approach is right because it directly addresses the core mandate of the CPAU ensuring compliance with underpayment regulations. By focusing on the specific information mandated by the relevant jurisdiction's labor laws and any applicable professional guidelines, e.g., those from a professional body like the CISI if UK regulations were specified, or relevant U.S. Department of Labor guidance if U.S. regulations were specified, the CPAU can definitively identify whether the pay stub is deficient. This systematic comparison ensures that the analysis is grounded in objective, legally defined standards, thereby providing a robust basis for identifying potential underpayments. The regulatory justification is that labor laws typically prescribe minimum information requirements on pay stubs to ensure transparency and employee understanding of their wages, hours, and deductions. Failure to provide this information can be a violation in itself, and it obstructs the employee's ability to detect underpayments. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the total net pay without verifying the underlying details fails to meet regulatory obligations. This is ethically and regulatorily flawed because the purpose of detailed pay stub information is precisely to allow for verification of the net pay calculation. Ignoring the components of the wage, such as hours worked, rate of pay, overtime calculations, and deductions, means that a potential underpayment in any of these areas would go undetected. This approach violates the principle of due diligence expected of a CPAU. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes identifying only obvious mathematical errors, while seemingly practical, is also insufficient. This is a regulatory failure because underpayments are not always due to simple arithmetic mistakes. They can arise from misclassification of hours, incorrect application of pay rates, improper overtime calculations, or unauthorized deductions, none of which might be immediately apparent as a mathematical error without examining the specific components of the pay stub against the regulatory requirements. This approach misses the subtler, yet equally critical, forms of underpayment. A further incorrect approach that relies on the employee's verbal confirmation of satisfaction with their pay is ethically and regulatorily unsound. Employee satisfaction does not equate to regulatory compliance. Employees may not fully understand their rights or the intricacies of their pay, or they may be hesitant to voice concerns. The CPAU role is to independently verify compliance based on established regulations, not to delegate this responsibility to the employee's subjective assessment. This approach abdicates the professional responsibility to ensure accurate and compliant compensation. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Understand the specific regulatory framework governing pay stubs in the relevant jurisdiction. 2. Obtain a copy of the pay stub in question. 3. Systematically review each piece of information on the pay stub against the regulatory requirements for mandatory content. 4. Identify any missing or inaccurately presented information. 5. If discrepancies are found, investigate the underlying cause by comparing the pay stub details with employment contracts, time records, and applicable wage and hour laws. 6. Document all findings, including the specific regulatory provisions that have been violated or are at risk of violation. 7. Formulate a professional opinion based on the evidence and regulatory requirements. Question 7. Quality control measures reveal that a significant number of individuals engaged by the company have been classified as independent contractors, despite performing duties that appear to be integral to the company's core operations and lacking the autonomy typically associated with independent contractor status. The internal audit team is tasked with addressing this potential misclassification and calculating any back wages and benefits owed. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the regulatory framework for calculating back wages and benefits under the Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA, in the United States? Option A. Offset any payments already made to the individuals against the calculated back wages without a detailed verification of whether those payments met the FLSA minimum wage and overtime requirements. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive review of the actual working relationship for each individual, applying the economic realities test to determine employee status. If misclassification is confirmed, calculate back wages based on the FLSA minimum wage and overtime requirements for all hours worked, and determine any other benefits that would have been provided to a properly classified employee, ensuring the worker is made whole for the entire period of misclassification. Option C. Rely on the existing independent contractor agreements and the stated preference of the individuals to be classified as independent contractors, as this reflects their mutual understanding of the working relationship. Option D. Calculate back wages only for the period from the date the potential misclassification was first flagged by the quality control measures to the present, assuming prior periods were compliant. The correct answer is B. Conduct a comprehensive review of the actual working relationship for each individual, applying the economic realities test to determine employee status. If misclassification is confirmed, calculate back wages based on the FLSA minimum wage and overtime requirements for all hours worked, and determine any other benefits that would have been provided to a properly classified employee, ensuring the worker is made whole for the entire period of misclassification. Explanation. This scenario presents a significant professional challenge because misclassification of employees can have far-reaching financial and legal consequences for an organization. The CPAU professional must exercise meticulous judgment to ensure compliance with the relevant regulatory framework, which in this case is the United States Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division, WHD guidelines under the Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA. The core of the challenge lies in accurately determining the employment status of individuals and, if misclassified, correctly calculating the resulting back wages and benefits owed. This requires a deep understanding of the FLSA tests for employee vs. independent contractor status, which are fact-specific and often nuanced. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the actual working relationship, applying the economic realities test as defined by the FLSA and relevant case law. This test focuses on whether the worker is economically dependent on the employer or is in business for themselves. If misclassification is identified, the correct approach mandates calculating back wages for all hours worked at the applicable minimum wage and overtime rates, as well as any other benefits that would have been provided to a properly classified employee, e.g., health insurance contributions, retirement plan contributions, paid time off. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the FLSA mandate to protect workers by ensuring they receive minimum wage, overtime pay, and other benefits. Adhering to these calculations upholds the spirit and letter of the law, preventing unjust enrichment of the employer and compensating the misclassified worker for their labor and lost benefits. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the worker's stated preference or a signed agreement would be professionally unacceptable. This fails to recognize that the FLSA determination of employee status is based on the reality of the working relationship, not contractual labels. Such an approach would violate the FLSA by ignoring the economic realities and potentially leaving workers without the protections they are legally entitled to. Another incorrect approach, which involves calculating back wages only for the period the misclassification was explicitly reported or discovered, is also professionally flawed. This ignores the continuous nature of the misclassification and the employer's ongoing obligation to comply with labor laws. It would result in underpayment of wages and benefits, failing to make the worker whole for the entire duration of the misclassification. A third incorrect approach, which attempts to offset the calculated back wages by any payments already made to the worker without verifying if those payments met the FLSA minimum wage and overtime requirements, is also problematic. This can lead to an inaccurate calculation of the actual amount owed. The FLSA requires that all compensation be accounted for against the minimum wage and overtime due. Simply offsetting without proper verification can result in a shortfall in the back wage calculation. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic review of all relevant facts concerning the working relationship. This includes examining factors such as the degree of control exercised by the employer, the worker's opportunity for profit or loss, the worker's investment in equipment or materials, the degree of skill required, the permanence of the relationship, and whether the work performed is an integral part of the employer's business. If misclassification is identified, a detailed and accurate calculation of back wages and benefits, in accordance with FLSA regulations and WHD guidance, must be performed. Transparency and prompt remediation are crucial to mitigate further legal and financial exposure and to demonstrate a commitment to ethical employment practices. Question 8. Process analysis reveals that a CPAU professional is tasked with verifying potential underpayments for a large cohort of employees. This involves accessing and processing sensitive employee information, including social security numbers, bank account details, and employment history. The professional needs to ensure this data is protected while facilitating the verification process. Which of the following approaches best adheres to data security and privacy requirements for protecting sensitive employee information within the CPAU regulatory framework? Option A. Primarily rely on employee self-attestation of their data accuracy and completeness, with minimal independent verification or security measures applied to the data collected. Option B. Store all sensitive employee information on a publicly accessible cloud storage service, using a single, easily shareable login credential for all team members involved in the verification. Option C. Share unencrypted sensitive employee data with external consultants who specialize in underpayment claims, relying on their general assurances of confidentiality without formal data processing agreements. Option D. Implement robust data encryption for all sensitive employee information both in transit and at rest. Establish granular access controls based on the principle of least privilege, and conduct regular security audits of data access logs. The correct answer is D. Implement robust data encryption for all sensitive employee information both in transit and at rest. Establish granular access controls based on the principle of least privilege, and conduct regular security audits of data access logs. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the operational need for efficient data processing with the paramount obligation to protect sensitive employee information. The Certified Professional Authority on Underpayments (CPAU) designation implies a responsibility to uphold the highest standards of data privacy, particularly when dealing with personal and financial data that could be subject to underpayment claims. The CPAU framework, aligned with relevant U.S. federal and state data privacy laws, mandates robust security measures and strict access controls. The correct approach involves implementing a multi-layered data security strategy that includes encryption, access controls, and regular audits. This aligns with the principles of data minimization and purpose limitation, ensuring that employee data is only accessed and processed for legitimate underpayment verification purposes. Regulatory frameworks such as the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act (HIPAA) for health-related information, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act (GLBA) for financial information, and various state-specific data privacy laws, e.g., California Consumer Privacy Act (CCPA), all emphasize the need for reasonable security measures to protect sensitive personal information. Ethical considerations also dictate that employees' privacy rights must be respected, and their data must be safeguarded against unauthorized access or disclosure. An incorrect approach that involves sharing unencrypted sensitive employee data with third-party vendors without a business associate agreement (BA) or equivalent data processing agreement that outlines specific security obligations and liability is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This directly violates data protection principles and exposes the organization to substantial legal penalties and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach, such as storing sensitive employee data on unsecured cloud storage accessible via generic login credentials, demonstrates a severe lack of due diligence and a failure to implement even basic security safeguards, contravening the reasonable security requirements of most data privacy laws. Finally, an approach that relies solely on employee self-reporting of data without any independent verification or security checks, while seemingly efficient, fails to adequately protect the integrity and confidentiality of the data, potentially leading to breaches or misuse. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a risk-based approach. Professionals must first identify the types of sensitive employee information being handled, assess the potential risks associated with its storage, processing, and transmission, and then implement controls commensurate with those risks. This involves understanding the applicable regulatory landscape, establishing clear data handling policies and procedures, providing regular employee training on data security best practices, and conducting periodic security assessments and audits. The CPAU framework emphasizes a proactive and preventative stance on data security, moving beyond mere compliance to embedding privacy and security into the core operational processes. Question 9. Consider a scenario where a certified professional authority on underpayments (CPAU) is tasked with investigating potential wage and hour compliance issues within a large organization. The CPAU decides to employ regression analysis to identify factors that may be influencing employee wage levels. After running the analysis, several factors emerge as statistically significant. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the professional responsibilities of a CPAU in this situation? Option A. Focus solely on the factors identified as statistically significant by the regression analysis and immediately recommend remediation based on these correlations, assuming they directly indicate underpayments. Option B. Disregard any factors identified by regression analysis that do not align with common or previously observed causes of underpayments, as these are likely to be statistical anomalies. Option C. Interpret the statistically significant factors identified by regression analysis as potential indicators of underpayment, and then conduct further in-depth investigation into the legal and practical implications of each factor to determine actual compliance issues. Option D. Use the regression analysis results to confirm pre-existing hypotheses about underpayment causes, prioritizing factors that support these hypotheses and downplaying those that do not. The correct answer is A. Focus solely on the factors identified as statistically significant by the regression analysis and immediately recommend remediation based on these correlations, assuming they directly indicate underpayments. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because accurately identifying the root causes of underpayments requires a nuanced understanding of statistical methods and their application within the specific regulatory framework governing wage and hour compliance. The Certified Professional Authority on Underpayments (CPAU) designation implies a responsibility to apply these tools ethically and effectively, adhering strictly to the relevant laws and guidelines. The difficulty lies in distinguishing between genuine statistical correlations and causal relationships that have direct implications for compliance and remediation. The correct approach involves using regression analysis to identify statistically significant factors that influence wage levels, and then critically evaluating these factors against established legal definitions of compensable work and permissible deductions. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the CPAU mandate to identify underpayments by systematically examining potential drivers. Regulatory frameworks, such as those enforced by the Department of Labor (DOL) in the U.S., emphasize the need for employers to accurately track and compensate all hours worked. Regression analysis, when applied thoughtfully, can highlight patterns that suggest potential misclassification of employees, incorrect calculation of overtime, or unauthorized deductions, all of which are direct violations. The ethical imperative is to use data-driven insights to ensure fair compensation and compliance, rather than to justify existing practices that may be non-compliant. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on the statistical significance of factors identified through regression analysis, without further investigation into their legal and practical implications. For instance, if regression shows a correlation between employee tenure and lower average hourly wages, simply concluding that longer-tenured employees are paid less is insufficient. This overlooks the possibility that the regression might be picking up on a legitimate factor like a tiered pay structure that is legally permissible, or conversely, it could be masking a discriminatory practice. Ethically, this approach fails to uphold the duty of due diligence required of a CPAU. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss factors identified by regression analysis if they do not immediately align with preconceived notions of underpayment causes. For example, if regression suggests that certain types of tasks, when performed by specific groups of employees, are associated with lower effective hourly rates, ignoring this finding because it doesn't fit a common underpayment scenario would be a failure. This approach violates the principle of objective analysis and can lead to overlooking systemic issues. A further incorrect approach is to interpret any statistically significant factor as definitive proof of underpayment without considering the context or potential for legitimate explanations. This can lead to overzealous accusations or misdirected remediation efforts. The CPAU role is to provide accurate and defensible findings, not to jump to conclusions based solely on statistical output. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a multi-step approach. 1. Clearly define the scope of the analysis and the specific compliance areas being investigated. 2. Select appropriate statistical methodologies, such as regression analysis, to explore potential relationships. 3. Critically interpret the statistical outputs, focusing on factors that are both statistically significant and have a plausible connection to wage and hour regulations. 4. Conduct further qualitative and quantitative investigation into identified factors to determine their root causes and legal implications. This may involve reviewing payroll records, job descriptions, timekeeping practices, and employee interviews. 5. Formulate conclusions and recommendations based on a comprehensive understanding of both the statistical findings and the applicable legal and regulatory framework. 6. Maintain objectivity and a commitment to ethical practice throughout the entire process, ensuring that findings are accurate, defensible, and aimed at achieving fair compensation and compliance. Question 10. Stakeholder feedback indicates a growing concern among employees regarding the clarity and accessibility of their pay statements and related employment records. An employer, seeking to streamline administrative processes, has implemented a policy that requires employees to submit a formal written request, with a minimum of 10 business days' notice, for any access to their historical pay records, and these records will only be provided in a raw data format that may require specialized software to interpret. Which approach best addresses the employer's obligations under the CPAU regulatory framework regarding record-keeping and employee access? Option A. Require employees to submit a formal written request with a minimum of 10 business days' notice for any access to historical pay records, and provide these records only in a raw data format that may require specialized software to interpret. Option B. Delegate the responsibility of providing pay records to individual employees to their direct line managers, who are instructed to only release information on a case-by-case basis after assessing the employee's perceived need. Option C. Limit employee access to pay records to only the most recent pay period, unless a formal dispute has been initiated, at which point all relevant records will be provided. Option D. Proactively maintain accurate and comprehensive employment records, including detailed pay information, and establish a clear, easily accessible process for employees to review these records upon reasonable request, providing them in an understandable format. Correct answer is D. Proactively maintain accurate and comprehensive employment records, including detailed pay information, and establish a clear, easily accessible process for employees to review these records upon reasonable request, providing them in an understandable format. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing an employer's obligation to maintain accurate records with an employee's right to access those records, all within the specific framework of the Certified Professional Authority on Underpayments CPAU regulatory environment. Misinterpreting or failing to adhere to these requirements can lead to significant underpayment claims, penalties, and reputational damage. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance while respecting employee rights. The correct approach involves proactively establishing a clear, accessible, and compliant system for record-keeping and employee access. This means ensuring that all required employment records, including those pertaining to pay, hours worked, and deductions, are maintained accurately and are readily available to employees upon request, in a format that is understandable and usable by the employee. This aligns with the CPAU emphasis on transparency and accuracy in compensation practices, aiming to prevent underpayments and facilitate fair resolution of disputes. The regulatory framework for CPAU mandates that employers maintain records that accurately reflect an employee's remuneration and working time, and that employees have a right to inspect these records. This proactive stance minimizes the risk of disputes and demonstrates a commitment to fair employment practices. An incorrect approach would be to delay or obstruct an employee's access to their pay records, citing administrative burden, or requiring the employee to submit a formal, lengthy request process that is not stipulated by regulation. This failure to provide timely access directly contravenes the employee's right to inspect their own remuneration records, which is a cornerstone of preventing and resolving underpayment issues. It suggests a lack of transparency and can be interpreted as an attempt to conceal potential discrepancies. Another incorrect approach would be to provide incomplete or inaccurate records, or records in a format that is not readily understandable by the employee. This undermines the purpose of record-keeping, which is to provide a clear and verifiable account of remuneration. If the records do not accurately reflect the employment terms or are presented in a way that makes them unintelligible, the employee cannot effectively verify their pay, thereby increasing the risk of underpayments going unnoticed and unresolved. This also fails to meet the spirit and letter of the CPAU regulations, which aim for clarity and accuracy. A further incorrect approach would be to only provide access to records upon the initiation of a formal dispute or legal action. This reactive stance is contrary to the preventative nature of robust record-keeping and employee access rights. The regulations are designed to empower employees to identify potential underpayments proactively, not solely as a last resort. Delaying access until a dispute escalates can exacerbate the situation, leading to greater financial and legal repercussions for the employer. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of the CPAU-specific record-keeping and employee access regulations. Employers should implement clear internal policies and procedures that align with these requirements, ensuring that all staff involved in record management are adequately trained. Regular internal audits of record-keeping practices and a commitment to prompt and transparent responses to employee requests for information are crucial. When faced with an employee request, the professional should prioritize facilitating access in a timely and comprehensible manner, adhering strictly to the regulatory framework to prevent potential underpayments and maintain ethical employment standards. Question 11. Compliance review shows that a mid-sized company, classified as an applicable large employer under the Affordable Care Act, ACA, is considering adjusting employee base salaries downwards to better absorb the increasing costs of providing minimum essential coverage that meets affordability and minimum value standards. What is the most prudent approach to assess the potential impact of these compensation adjustments on ACA compliance and employee compensation integrity? Option A. Conduct a detailed analysis of the employer's ACA reporting obligations, including the calculation of potential penalties for failing to offer adequate coverage, and evaluate how any proposed salary reductions might affect the affordability of the employer-sponsored health insurance for employees, considering the ACA's affordability safe harbors. Option B. Implement the salary reductions and then retroactively assess ACA compliance, relying on the assumption that the IRS will provide grace periods for any discovered discrepancies related to compensation and benefits. Option C. Focus solely on ensuring the health insurance plan itself provides minimum value, as this is the primary requirement of the ACA, and disregard the impact of salary reductions on employee take-home pay and overall compensation fairness. Option D. Proceed with the salary reductions as planned, assuming that as long as the company continues to offer a health plan, it is fulfilling its primary ACA obligation, and any compensation adjustments are purely an internal financial matter. The correct answer is A. Conduct a detailed analysis of the employer's ACA reporting obligations, including the calculation of potential penalties for failing to offer adequate coverage, and evaluate how any proposed salary reductions might affect the affordability of the employer-sponsored health insurance for employees, considering the ACA's affordability safe harbors. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of how the Affordable Care Act, ACA, impacts employer obligations regarding health insurance and potential compensation adjustments, specifically concerning the employer mandate and its interaction with employee compensation strategies. The CPAU professional must navigate the complexities of regulatory compliance while ensuring fair and accurate compensation practices. The correct approach involves a thorough assessment of the employer's responsibilities under the ACA's Employer Shared Responsibility provisions. This includes determining if the employer is a large employer subject to the mandate, evaluating the affordability and minimum value of the offered health coverage, and understanding the potential penalties for noncompliance. The ACA mandates that applicable large employers offer minimum essential coverage that is affordable and provides minimum value to at least 95% of their full-time employees and their dependents, or face potential penalties. Compensation adjustments must be evaluated in light of these obligations, ensuring that any changes do not inadvertently create compliance issues or disadvantage employees in a manner that violates the spirit or letter of the ACA. This approach prioritizes regulatory adherence and employee well-being. An incorrect approach would be to assume that the ACA's provisions are solely about providing insurance and have no bearing on compensation structures. This overlooks the critical link between offering affordable coverage and the potential for penalties that could influence financial decisions, including compensation. Another incorrect approach would be to unilaterally reduce employee base compensation to offset the cost of providing ACA-compliant health insurance without a comprehensive analysis of the ACA's affordability safe harbors and the potential impact on employees' overall financial well-being and tax liabilities. This could lead to employees being classified as undercompensated relative to the value of their total compensation package, including benefits, and could also trigger penalties if the reduced compensation, combined with the cost of insurance, falls below certain thresholds, or if the employer fails to meet its coverage obligations. A further incorrect approach would be to focus solely on the minimum value of the health plan without considering its affordability component, as both are critical for avoiding ACA penalties and ensuring employees are not unduly burdened by premium costs. Professional decision-making in similar situations requires a proactive and comprehensive risk assessment. This involves staying abreast of ACA regulations and guidance, consulting with legal and benefits experts, and conducting regular audits of compensation and benefits packages. The process should involve evaluating the employer's status under the ACA, analyzing the cost and structure of health plans, and understanding the implications for employee compensation. Any proposed compensation changes should be modeled against ACA compliance requirements and potential employee impact. Question 12. The risk matrix shows a significant cluster of transactions in the high likelihood of underpayment category, primarily related to a specific vendor and a particular service type. The CPAU mandate is to ensure accurate financial reporting and compliance with underpayment regulations. Which of the following actions best reflects a proactive and compliant approach to underpayment identification and detection in this scenario? Option A. Conduct a broad, company-wide audit of all vendor payments to identify any potential underpayments, irrespective of the risk matrix. Option B. Wait for the vendor to report a discrepancy or for a customer complaint before investigating the flagged transactions. Option C. Initiate a detailed review of all transactions associated with the identified vendor and service type, focusing on the specific parameters flagged in the risk matrix. Option D. Disregard the risk matrix findings, as they are merely indicators and do not constitute definitive proof of underpayment. The correct answer is C. Initiate a detailed review of all transactions associated with the identified vendor and service type, focusing on the specific parameters flagged in the risk matrix. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the Certified Professional Authority on Underpayments CPAU to move beyond simple data reconciliation and engage in a proactive, risk-based approach to identifying potential underpayments. The challenge lies in interpreting the nuances of the risk matrix, which is not a definitive indicator of underpayment, but rather a signal of heightened probability. The CPAU must exercise professional judgment to determine the appropriate level of investigation without causing undue disruption or incurring excessive costs. This requires a deep understanding of the regulatory framework governing underpayments, which mandates a commitment to accuracy and fairness in financial transactions. Correct approach involves a targeted investigation based on the risk matrix's highest rated areas. This is right because it aligns with the principle of efficient resource allocation and focuses investigative efforts where they are most likely to yield results, thereby fulfilling the regulatory obligation to identify and rectify underpayments. It demonstrates a commitment to due diligence and a proactive stance in maintaining compliance with underpayment regulation. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the risk matrix entirely due to its probabilistic nature. This fails to acknowledge the regulatory expectation that entities should actively seek out potential discrepancies. Another incorrect approach would be to initiate a full, exhaustive audit of all transactions regardless of risk score. This is inefficient and potentially burdensome, exceeding the reasonable scope of investigation suggested by a risk assessment, and failing to prioritize resources effectively as expected under regulatory guidance. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to only investigate if a specific complaint is received. This reactive stance is insufficient. The regulatory framework implies a duty to proactively identify and address potential underpayments, not merely to respond to external triggers. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Understanding the purpose and limitations of risk assessment tools like the risk matrix. 2. Prioritizing investigative efforts based on the risk assessment, focusing on areas flagged as high probability. 3. Employing a tiered approach to investigation, escalating scrutiny based on initial findings. 4. Documenting the rationale for investigative decisions and the outcomes. 5. Ensuring all actions are consistent with the spirit and letter of the applicable underpayment regulations. Question 13. Cost-benefit analysis shows that a more aggressive interpretation of penalty provisions could potentially deter future underpayments more effectively, but the regulatory framework for Certified Professional Authority on Underpayments, CPAU, mandates a specific, formulaic approach to quantifying damages and penalties. Considering the CPAU obligation to adhere strictly to the established regulatory framework, which approach to quantifying damages and penalties is most professionally appropriate and ethically sound. Option A. Advocate for a revised regulatory framework that allows for more discretionary penalty application, while proceeding with a conservative estimate based on current regulations. Option B. Utilize a generalized estimation of potential penalties based on industry best practices to deter future underpayments, even if it deviates from the specific statutory formulas. Option C. Apply the prescribed statutory formulas and penalty provisions precisely as outlined in the regulatory framework, ensuring all calculations are meticulously documented. Option D. Focus on minimizing the perceived financial burden on the payer by selectively interpreting penalty clauses to present a less severe outcome. The correct answer is C. Apply the prescribed statutory formulas and penalty provisions precisely as outlined in the regulatory framework, ensuring all calculations are meticulously documented. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the Certified Professional Authority on Underpayments CPAU must navigate the complexities of quantifying damages and penalties in a manner that is both compliant with the relevant regulatory framework and ethically sound. The challenge lies in balancing the need for accurate financial assessment with the potential for punitive measures, ensuring that the chosen approach aligns with the spirit and letter of the law and avoids creating undue hardship or misrepresenting the situation. Careful judgment is required to select an approach that is defensible, transparent, and serves the overarching goal of fair resolution. The correct approach involves a meticulous and documented application of the prescribed statutory formulas and penalty provisions as outlined in the relevant regulatory framework. This method is correct because it adheres strictly to the established legal and regulatory guidelines for calculating underpayments, associated interest, and any applicable penalties. This ensures objectivity, consistency, and legal defensibility. The regulatory framework mandates a specific methodology for these calculations, and deviating from it risks legal challenge and reputational damage. Ethical practice demands adherence to these established procedures to ensure fairness and predictability for all parties involved. An incorrect approach that relies solely on a generalized estimation of potential penalties, without reference to the specific statutory calculation, fails to meet the regulatory requirements. This is ethically problematic as it introduces subjectivity and can lead to either an overestimation, causing undue distress to the payer, or an underestimation, failing to adequately compensate the payee and potentially violating the spirit of the penalty provisions designed to deter underpayments. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes minimizing the perceived financial burden on the payer by selectively interpreting or downplaying the severity of penalty clauses, even if not explicitly calculating them, is also professionally unacceptable. This demonstrates a lack of integrity and a failure to uphold the regulatory mandate. It can be seen as an attempt to circumvent the intended consequences of underpayment, undermining the regulatory system's effectiveness and potentially leading to a breach of professional duty. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of the specific regulatory framework governing underpayments and penalties. Professionals must identify the precise statutory formulas and penalty provisions applicable to the case. They should then meticulously gather all necessary data to apply these formulas accurately and document every step of the calculation process. Transparency with all parties regarding the methodology used is crucial. If there is ambiguity in the regulations, seeking clarification from the relevant regulatory body or legal counsel is a prudent step before proceeding. The ultimate goal is to achieve a fair and legally compliant outcome that reflects the severity of the underpayment and its consequences. Question 14. Benchmark analysis indicates that employers often grapple with distinguishing between compensation elements that are subject to ERISA oversight and those that are not. Considering the Certified Professional Authority on Underpayments, CPAU, exams focus on regulatory frameworks. Which of the following approaches best reflects the correct application of ERISA impact on benefits and compensation for a U.S.-based employer? Option A. Carefully analyzing each compensation and benefit arrangement to determine if it meets ERISA definition of a plan, and then applying ERISA requirements only to those arrangements that qualify, while ensuring that non-ERISA arrangements do not inadvertently become ERISA plans. Option B. Assuming that any arrangement providing a financial benefit to employees, regardless of its structure or intent, automatically falls under ERISA jurisdiction, necessitating the implementation of all ERISA compliance measures. Option C. Focusing solely on traditional pension and health insurance plans as ERISA-covered benefits, while treating all other compensation arrangements, such as stock options and severance pay, as outside ERISA scope without further analysis. Option D. Classifying all forms of employee remuneration, including discretionary bonuses and profit-sharing contributions, as ERISA-governed benefits requiring full compliance with reporting and fiduciary standards. The correct answer is D. Classifying all forms of employee remuneration, including discretionary bonuses and profit-sharing contributions, as ERISA-governed benefits requiring full compliance with reporting and fiduciary standards. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a nuanced understanding of how the Employee Retirement Income Security Act (ERISA) impacts both employee benefits and compensation, particularly in situations where there might be perceived overlaps or conflicts. Professionals must navigate the complexities of ERISA fiduciary duties, reporting requirements, and non-discrimination rules to ensure compliance and protect employee interests. The challenge lies in distinguishing between what constitutes a protected benefit under ERISA and what is considered general compensation, and how these distinctions affect plan design and administration. Careful judgment is required to avoid misinterpreting ERISA scope, which could lead to significant legal and financial repercussions. The correct approach involves a comprehensive review of the employer's compensation structure and any associated benefit plans to determine which components fall under ERISA purview. This includes identifying if a plan is intended to provide retirement income, health coverage, or other welfare benefits, and if it is established or maintained by an employer or employee organization. ERISA impact on benefits is direct, mandating certain standards for participation, vesting, funding, and disclosure. For compensation, ERISA impact is more indirect, primarily concerning how certain compensation elements might be structured to avoid being deemed an ERISA plan, or how they interact with ERISA-governed benefits. This approach prioritizes adherence to ERISA-specific provisions regarding plan identification, fiduciary responsibilities, and participant rights, ensuring that all obligations are met and that employees receive the benefits to which they are entitled under the law. An incorrect approach would be to assume that all forms of employee remuneration are subject to ERISA, or conversely, that ERISA only applies to traditional pension plans. This oversimplification ignores the specific definitions and criteria within ERISA for what constitutes a plan and what types of benefits are covered. For instance, treating a discretionary bonus program as an ERISA welfare benefit plan without proper ERISA plan establishment would be a misclassification, leading to potential violations of reporting and disclosure requirements. Similarly, failing to recognize that certain unfunded executive deferred compensation arrangements might be exempt from ERISA under specific safe harbors, and instead attempting to apply all ERISA fiduciary standards, would be an unnecessary and potentially burdensome overreach. Another incorrect approach would be to disregard the non-discrimination rules inherent in ERISA, which prohibit plans from unfairly favoring highly compensated employees, thereby undermining the equitable distribution of benefits. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should begin with a thorough understanding of the employer's compensation and benefits offerings. This involves meticulously examining the nature, purpose, and administration of each component. A critical step is to consult ERISA definitions and regulations to accurately classify each offering. If an offering appears to be an ERISA plan, then all applicable fiduciary duties, reporting, disclosure, and non-discrimination requirements must be rigorously applied. If an offering is not an ERISA plan, it is crucial to ensure that its structure and administration do not inadvertently create an ERISA plan or violate other applicable laws. Seeking expert legal counsel specializing in ERISA is often a necessary step to ensure accurate interpretation and compliance. Question 15. The risk matrix shows a heightened concern regarding potential overtime underpayments for a remote sales team whose members are geographically dispersed across several U.S. states, with some employees occasionally traveling to different states for client meetings. The company has a standard overtime policy that aligns with Federal Fair Labor Standards Act (FLSA) requirements. A CPAU is tasked with assessing and mitigating this risk. Which of the following approaches best addresses the CPAU responsibility in this scenario? Option A. Suggests that the company implement a uniform overtime policy across all states based on the most lenient state overtime laws identified to simplify administration and avoid potential disputes over differing state regulations. Option B. Focus solely on the FLSA exemption criteria for executive, administrative, and professional employees, assuming that most sales roles would fall under these exemptions and therefore not be eligible for overtime, regardless of state-specific nuances. Option C. Recommend a comprehensive review of each employee's primary work location and any states where significant work is performed, followed by an analysis of each relevant state's specific overtime laws to ensure compliance beyond the federal minimums, and implement a system for accurate work-hour tracking that accounts for travel time. Option D. Advise the company to adhere strictly to the federal FLSA overtime provisions, as these are the minimum standards and generally apply unless a state law is more stringent, and assume that the company's current policy is sufficient for all employees, regardless of their state of residence or work. The correct answer is D. Advise the company to adhere strictly to the federal FLSA overtime provisions, as these are the minimum standards and generally apply unless a state law is more stringent, and assume that the company's current policy is sufficient for all employees regardless of their state of residence or work. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of state-specific overtime laws, which can vary significantly and are often subject to interpretation. The Certified Professional Authority on Underpayments (CPAU) designation implies a responsibility to ensure compliance with all applicable labor laws, and failing to do so can result in significant financial penalties, legal disputes, and reputational damage. The core of the challenge lies in identifying and applying the correct state law when an employee's work spans multiple jurisdictions or when the employer operates in a state with complex overtime exemptions. The correct approach involves meticulously researching and applying the overtime laws of the state where the employee primarily performs their work, or where the employment relationship is principally based, as defined by relevant state statutes and case law. This requires understanding the specific definitions of workweek, overtime, and any applicable exemptions e.g. for executive, administrative, or professional employees or specific industry exemptions. The CPAU must then ensure that compensation practices align with these state-specific requirements, particularly concerning the calculation of the regular rate of pay and the overtime premium. This approach is ethically and regulatorily sound because it prioritizes accurate compliance with the governing jurisdiction's laws, thereby protecting both the employee's rights and the employer's legal standing. An incorrect approach would be to assume that federal overtime laws, Fair Labor Standards Act (FLSA), are sufficient and supersede all state laws. This is a critical regulatory failure because many states have enacted overtime laws that are more protective of employees than federal law, including lower thresholds for overtime eligibility or broader definitions of compensable work time. Another incorrect approach is to apply a one-size-fits-all policy across all states without considering state-specific variations. This ignores the fundamental principle that employment law is often jurisdiction-dependent and can lead to underpayment in states with stricter requirements. Finally, relying solely on an employee's self-reported hours without a robust system for tracking and verifying work time, especially for non-exempt employees, is a significant compliance risk and an ethical lapse, as it can lead to unintentional underpayments and a failure to meet legal obligations for overtime compensation. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should begin with a thorough identification of all applicable jurisdictions for each employee. This involves understanding where the work is performed and where the employment relationship is established. Next, the CPAU must consult the specific statutes, regulations, and relevant case law for each identified jurisdiction regarding overtime. This research should focus on identifying any state-specific provisions that are more stringent than federal law. Once the applicable requirements are understood, Compensation policies and practices must be reviewed and updated to ensure full compliance. Regular audits and a system for tracking and verifying work hours are essential to maintain ongoing compliance and to proactively identify and address potential underpayment issues. Question 16. Market research demonstrates that a growing number of companies are exploring innovative wage payment methods to streamline payroll and enhance employee convenience. A multinational corporation with employees in multiple U.S. states is considering implementing a company-wide policy to pay all employees exclusively via direct deposit, believing this to be the most efficient and modern approach. However, the Certified Professional Authority on Underpayments (CPAU), responsible for payroll compliance, is aware that state laws can differ significantly regarding wage payment. Which of the following approaches best ensures compliance with U.S. state-specific wage payment laws? Option A. Research and adhere to the specific wage payment method requirements of each state where employees are physically located and performing their work, ensuring any chosen method is legally permissible and accessible. Option B. Implement direct deposit as the sole payment method for all employees, as it is widely adopted and efficient. Option C. Adopt the payment methods used by the majority of companies in the same industry, assuming these practices are compliant. Option D. Proceed with direct deposit for all employees and address any state-specific concerns on a reactive basis if an issue arises. The correct answer is B. Implement direct deposit as the sole payment method for all employees, as it is widely adopted and efficient. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of state-specific wage payment laws, which can vary significantly in their requirements for methods of payment. A Certified Professional Authority on Underpayments (CPAU) must navigate these differences to ensure compliance and avoid penalties, while also considering the practicalities for both employers and employees. The core challenge lies in the potential for a seemingly minor deviation from a state's specific requirements to constitute a violation. The correct approach involves diligently researching and adhering to the specific wage payment method requirements of the state where the employees are physically located and performing their work. This means understanding if the state mandates direct deposit, requires the option for paper checks, or has specific rules about pay cards. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the legal mandate. Compliance with state-specific wage payment laws is paramount to avoid underpayment claims, penalties, and potential litigation. Ethical practice dictates that employers must pay wages in a manner that is legally permissible and accessible to their employees. An incorrect approach would be to assume that a single, uniform payment method, such as direct deposit only, is acceptable across all states. This fails to acknowledge the diversity of state regulations. Many states have specific provisions that may require employers to offer alternative payment methods if an employee does not have a bank account or prefers a different form of payment. This can lead to violations of wage payment laws, resulting in penalties, interest, and potential legal action. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on industry best practices or the practices of other companies without verifying compliance with the specific state's laws. While industry norms can be informative, they do not supersede legal requirements. A company might be operating in a state with stringent wage payment laws that are not being met by a common industry practice. This can expose the company to significant legal and financial risks. A further incorrect approach is to implement a new payment method without first confirming its legality in all relevant states. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence. Before introducing a new pay card system, for instance, a CPAU must verify that the state laws permit such a method, and if so, what specific disclosures or employee consent requirements must be met. Failure to do so could result in the payment method itself being deemed illegal, leading to underpayment claims. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should begin with identifying the primary jurisdiction, governing the employment relationship, which is typically the state where the employee performs their work. Next, the CPAU must consult the specific statutes and administrative regulations of those states concerning wage payment methods. This research should focus on any mandated methods, prohibited methods, and requirements for employee consent or alternative options. Once the legal requirements are understood, the CPAU can then assess the company's current payment practices against these mandates and implement necessary adjustments to ensure full compliance. This proactive and research-driven approach minimizes risk and upholds both legal and ethical obligations. Question 17. Compliance review shows that the data visualization of employee payment data reveals several unusual patterns, including a cluster of employees with consistently lower than average payments for overtime hours and a noticeable dip in bonus payouts for a specific department during the last quarter. What is the most appropriate next step for the Certified Professional Authority on Underpayments, CPAU, to take? Option A. Initiate a detailed audit of the identified employees and the department to verify the accuracy of the payment data and investigate the root causes of the observed discrepancies. Option B. Focus on creating more complex and detailed visualizations to try and pinpoint the exact cause of the anomalies without directly investigating the underlying data. Option C. Immediately inform the affected employees and the department head that underpayments have been identified based on the visual data. Option D. Conclude that the visual patterns are likely due to minor data entry errors and do not warrant further investigation, as the overall payment system appears to be functioning correctly. The correct answer is A. Initiate a detailed audit of the identified employees and the department to verify the accuracy of the payment data and investigate the root causes of the observed discrepancies. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the ethical obligation to report potential underpayments with the practical need for accurate and defensible data. The Certified Professional Authority on Underpayments, CPAU designation, implies a commitment to upholding regulatory standards and ethical conduct in identifying and rectifying underpayments. The core difficulty lies in interpreting visual data, which can be subjective, and ensuring that any conclusions drawn are robust enough to withstand scrutiny and lead to appropriate action, without causing undue alarm or misdirection. The correct approach involves using data visualization tools to identify patterns and outliers that suggest potential underpayments, and then initiating a deeper, more granular investigation to confirm these suspicions. This aligns with the CPAU mandate to ensure accuracy and compliance. By focusing on visual cues that indicate deviations from expected payment patterns, such as unusual spikes or dips in payment amounts for specific employee groups or time periods, the professional can efficiently flag areas for further scrutiny. This method is ethically sound as it prioritizes thoroughness and avoids premature accusations. It is also regulatorily compliant by adhering to a systematic process of identification and verification, ensuring that any subsequent actions are based on confirmed facts. An incorrect approach would be to immediately flag all visually identified discrepancies as confirmed underpayments without further investigation. This fails to acknowledge the inherent limitations of data visualization, which can sometimes be misleading due to data entry errors, system glitches, or legitimate, albeit unusual, payment variations. Such an approach risks making unsubstantiated claims, potentially damaging employee trust and organizational reputation, and could lead to unnecessary corrective actions or disputes. It also violates the principle of due diligence required by regulatory frameworks that emphasize accuracy and evidence-based decision-making. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss all visual anomalies as insignificant without any attempt to understand their potential implications. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and a failure to proactively identify potential compliance issues. It could lead to the overlooking of genuine underpayments, thereby exposing the organization to regulatory penalties and financial liabilities. This approach neglects the ethical responsibility to protect employees from financial harm and to ensure fair compensation. A third incorrect approach would be to rely solely on anecdotal evidence or subjective interpretations of the visualizations, rather than seeking objective confirmation. Data visualization is a tool to guide investigation, not a substitute for it. Basing conclusions on personal feelings about the charts, rather than on a systematic process of verification, undermines the credibility of the findings and the professional's judgment. This is ethically problematic as it introduces bias and can lead to unfair outcomes. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve a structured approach. First, utilize data visualization to identify potential areas of concern. Second, develop hypotheses about the nature of the discrepancies. Third, conduct targeted investigations to gather factual evidence to confirm or refute these hypotheses. And finally, take appropriate action based on verified findings. This iterative process ensures that conclusions are data-driven, ethically sound, and regulatorily compliant. Question 18. The evaluation methodology shows that in assessing punitive damages for an underpayment case, a CPAU professional must consider various factors to ensure fairness and adherence to regulatory intent. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the CPAU framework for determining the appropriateness and quantum of punitive damages? Option A. A comprehensive review of the employer's conduct to ascertain the level of intent, malice, or reckless disregard for employee rights, coupled with an assessment of the employer's financial capacity to determine if punitive damages are warranted and at what level. Option B. A primary focus on the total financial hardship experienced by the employee as a result of the underpayment, using this as the sole basis for calculating any punitive award. Option C. The imposition of punitive damages solely based on the discovery of any underpayment, regardless of the employer's intent or the specific circumstances surrounding the violation. Option D. The automatic application of a fixed percentage increase to the calculated underpayment amount, based on the duration of the underpayment, to serve as a punitive measure. The correct answer is A. A comprehensive review of the employer's conduct to ascertain the level of intent, malice, or reckless disregard for employee rights, coupled with an assessment of the employer's financial capacity to determine if punitive damages are warranted and at what level. Explanation. The evaluation methodology shows that assessing punitive damages in underpayment cases presents a significant professional challenge due to the inherent subjectivity involved and the potential for disproportionate financial penalties. Professionals must navigate the fine line between adequately compensating the wronged party and imposing penalties that are just and reasonable, aligning with the principles of fairness and deterrence without becoming punitive for punitive's sake. This requires a deep understanding of the specific regulatory framework governing punitive damages within the Certified Professional Authority on Underpayments (CPAU) jurisdiction. The correct approach involves a meticulous examination of the employer's conduct, focusing on the egregiousness of the underpayment and the intent behind it. This includes evaluating whether the underpayment was willful, malicious, fraudulent, or demonstrated a reckless disregard for employee rights. The regulatory framework for CPAU mandates that punitive damages are not awarded lightly and must be supported by clear and convincing evidence of such conduct. The purpose is to punish and deter similar future behavior, not merely to compensate for the economic loss. Therefore, a reasoned assessment that directly links the severity of the employer's actions to the justification for punitive damages, considering factors like the duration and pervasiveness of the underpayment and the employer's financial capacity to absorb a penalty, is paramount. An incorrect approach would be to automatically apply a predetermined multiplier to the compensatory damages without a thorough analysis of the employer's intent and conduct. This fails to meet the regulatory requirement for a case-specific assessment of egregiousness and can lead to awards that are excessive and not aligned with the deterrent purpose. Another incorrect approach is to focus solely on the financial impact of the underpayment on the employee, neglecting the critical element of the employer's culpability. Punitive damages are not a form of enhanced compensation. They are a penalty. Awarding them without demonstrating the requisite level of malicious intent or reckless disregard for the law would violate the spirit and letter of the CPAU regulations. Furthermore, ignoring the employer's financial standing when determining the amount of punitive damages can result in penalties that are either too insignificant to deter or financially ruinous, neither of which serves the regulatory objective. The professional decision-making process for assessing punitive damages should follow a structured framework. First, determine if the conduct meets the threshold for punitive damages under the CPAU regulations, e.g., willfulness, malice, fraud. Second, if the threshold is met, gather evidence to quantify the egregiousness of the conduct. Third, consider the employer's financial resources to ensure the penalty is meaningful but not confiscatory. Finally, articulate a clear, evidence-based rationale for the decision to award or deny punitive damages, and for the specific amount if awarded, directly referencing the applicable CPAU provisions. Question 19. The risk matrix shows a heightened probability of noncompliance with the Immigration Reform and Control Act, IRCA, employment eligibility verification requirements due to a recent increase in hiring individuals from diverse national origins. To mitigate this risk, which of the following approaches best aligns with IRCA mandates and anti-discrimination provisions? Option A. Accept photocopies of identification documents for Form I-9 completion, provided the hiring manager believes the photocopies are legitimate. Option B. Implement a policy requiring all new hires to present a U.S. passport or permanent resident card, Form I-551, for Form I-9 verification, regardless of their actual citizenship or work authorization status. Option C. Advise hiring managers to request additional documentation from any new hire who speaks with a foreign accent or appears to be of foreign descent to ensure their work authorization. Option D. Develop a standardized checklist for all new hires that outlines acceptable documents for Form I-9 verification, ensuring the checklist is applied consistently and that no additional documentation is requested beyond what is listed and appears genuine. The correct answer is B. Implement a policy requiring all new hires to present a U.S. passport or permanent resident card, Form I-551, for Form I-9 verification, regardless of their actual citizenship or work authorization status. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of the Immigration Reform and Control Act (IRCA) and its employment eligibility verification requirements, specifically the Form I-9 process. The core challenge lies in balancing the employer's legal obligation to verify employment eligibility with the prohibition against discrimination based on national origin or citizenship status. A misstep can lead to significant legal penalties, including fines and lawsuits, as well as damage to the company's reputation. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance without creating a discriminatory environment. The correct approach involves a thorough and consistent application of the Form I-9 verification process for all newly hired individuals, regardless of perceived national origin or citizenship. This includes examining original documents presented by the employee, ensuring they appear genuine and relate to the individual, and completing the Form I-9 accurately and within the prescribed timeframes. This approach is ethically sound and legally compliant because it adheres strictly to the mandates of IRCA, which requires employers to verify the identity and employment authorization of all individuals hired in the United States. It treats all employees equally in the verification process, thereby avoiding any appearance or reality of discrimination. An incorrect approach that involves asking for specific documents beyond what is acceptable under the Form I-9, or requesting additional documentation from individuals who appear to be foreign-born, is a direct violation of IRCA anti-discrimination provisions. This creates a discriminatory hiring practice by subjecting certain individuals to a more rigorous or different verification process based on their national origin or perceived citizenship status, which is explicitly prohibited. Another incorrect approach that involves accepting photocopies of documents or failing to examine original documents is a failure to comply with the employer's affirmative duty to verify employment eligibility. This can lead to penalties for noncompliance with the Form I-9 requirements, as the employer has not fulfilled its obligation to ensure the presented documents are valid and belong to the employee. Finally, an incorrect approach that involves delaying the completion of the Form I-9 or not completing it within the statutory deadlines exposes the employer to penalties for noncompliance. IRCA mandates specific timelines for the completion of the Form I-9, and failure to adhere to these deadlines constitutes a violation of the law. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a commitment to ongoing training on IRCA and related anti-discrimination laws. Employers should establish clear, written policies and procedures for Form I-9 compliance that are applied uniformly to all new hires. Regular internal audits of Form I-9 records can help identify and correct any deviations from policy or regulatory requirements. When in doubt, consulting with legal counsel specializing in immigration and employment law is crucial to ensure compliance and mitigate risk. Question 20. Strategic planning requires a robust approach to identifying potential payroll underpayments. When analyzing large datasets of employee compensation and hours worked, what is the most compliant and ethically sound method for a certified professional authority on underpayments, CPAU, to query and analyze this data to detect discrepancies, while strictly adhering to data privacy regulations? Option A. Directly export raw payroll data, including all personally identifiable information, PI such as names, addresses, and social security numbers, to a separate spreadsheet for manual review and comparison against expected pay rates. Option B. Request individual employee consent for each data point to be accessed and analyzed, and then manually review each employee's payroll records one by one to identify any anomalies. Option C. Utilize third-party data analytics software that requires uploading the entire raw payroll database, including all sensitive employee information, without implementing any specific data masking or anonymization protocols within the software itself. Option D. Develop and execute database queries that aggregate payroll data, applying anonymization or pseudonymization techniques to employee identifiers before analysis, or generating summary statistics that do not reveal individual employee details. The correct answer is D. Develop and execute database queries that aggregate payroll data, applying anonymization or pseudonymization techniques to employee identifiers before analysis, or generating summary statistics that do not reveal individual employee details. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the need for comprehensive data analysis to identify underpayments with the strict data privacy and security regulations governing payroll information. The Certified Professional Authority on Underpayments (CPAU) designation implies a commitment to upholding these standards. Careful judgment is required to ensure that while data is interrogated for compliance, it is also protected from unauthorized access or misuse. The correct approach involves utilizing advanced database querying techniques that allow for the aggregation and analysis of payroll data without exposing sensitive personal identifiers. This method upholds the principle of data minimization and privacy by design, which is a cornerstone of many data protection frameworks. Specifically, employing anonymization or pseudonymization techniques within the query itself, or by creating aggregated, non-identifiable datasets for analysis, ensures that the investigation can proceed without violating individual privacy rights. This aligns with regulatory requirements that mandate the protection of personal data and limit its processing to necessary and proportionate purposes. An incorrect approach that involves directly querying and exporting raw payroll data containing employee names, social security numbers, or other personally identifiable information (PI) for analysis presents significant regulatory and ethical failures. This action directly contravenes data protection laws that require explicit consent or a legitimate legal basis for processing such sensitive data. It also exposes the organization to substantial risks of data breaches and identity theft, leading to severe financial penalties and reputational damage. Furthermore, it violates the ethical obligation of a CPAU to act with integrity and diligence in handling sensitive financial and personal information. Another incorrect approach that relies on manual data extraction and review of individual employee records without a clear, documented audit trail or a defined scope for the review is also professionally unacceptable. This method is inefficient, prone to human error, and lacks the systematic rigor expected of a professional underpayment investigation. It fails to provide a defensible basis for any findings and can lead to inconsistent or incomplete identification of underpayments. Ethically, it demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to employ best practices in data analysis, potentially leaving underpayments undiscovered or incorrectly identified. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should begin with a thorough understanding of the applicable regulatory framework, including data protection laws and any specific guidelines for underpayment investigations. Next, identify the specific objectives of the data analysis and the types of data required to achieve those objectives. Then, evaluate available database querying and analytical tools, prioritizing those that support data anonymization, pseudonymization, or aggregation. Develop a detailed plan for data extraction and analysis that explicitly outlines data handling procedures, security measures, and access controls. Finally, ensure that all analytical activities are documented, auditable, and compliant with both legal and ethical standards.